My title for today's talk comes from 1893. Specifically, it comes from the penultimate Gilbert and Sullivan collaboration, Utopia Limited, among the most embittered and among the least popular of the G&S operas. In the grand finale, King Paramount's daughter, Princess Zara, delivers herself of the following paroxysmal tribute to Britain. There's a little group of isles beyond the wave, so tiny you might almost wonder where it is. That nation is the bravest of the brave, and cowards are the rarest of all rarities. The proudest nations yield at her command. She terrifies all foreign-born rapscallions, and holds the peace of Europe in her hand with 60 invincible battalions. To which the princess's father responds, "Oh, may we copy all her maxims wise, and imitate her virtues and her charities, and may we by degrees acclimatize her parliamentary peculiarities. By doing so, we shall in course of time regenerate completely our entire land." You can already guess what the rhyme is going to be. "Great Britain is the monarchy sublime, to which some add, but others do not, Ireland." I mention this quote because after we've divided through for the obvious elements of Gilbertian sarcasm, so much of it is actually the plain truth of British culture in 1893. Cowards, at least open cowards, really were the rarest of all rarities. The proudest nations really did yield at Britain's command, and as for 60 invincible battalions, foreigners really did marvel at how small Britain's armed forces were. As late as 1880, it required only 66,000 troops to administer the entire British Raj, which at the time consisted of approximately 243 million people. In short, Gilbert's words confirm the wisdom of Orwell's epigram from half a century later, that parody usually implies a real affection for the thing parodied. As far as the Dublin-born Sir Charles Villiers Stanford is concerned, the crucial word from that quote is the word isles, in the plural, not the singular. Stanford's central political conviction, one could call it his central spiritual conviction also, was a belief in the fundamental indissolubility of Irish civilization and English civilization. In the 20th century, many a despot would accuse his domestic enemies of having dual loyalties. For Stanford, this would have been incomprehensible. Rather, where Britain was concerned, Stanford harboured a single loyalty, culturally bifurcated. No one knows precisely why Stanford, having confined most of his organ writing to smallish works before the Great War, should suddenly have produced 5 big organ sonatas between 1917 and 1918, but so he did. As none of the sonatas can be called readily amenable to ecclesiastical use, Stanford must have had the concert hall in mind for all of them, but neither in his own time nor in any subsequent time have recitalists shown much interest in them. Hypotheses abundantly offer themselves for why Stanford wrote them. With the exception of the first sonata, which might as well have been written in peacetime, they all appear to yield their secrets only when considered in the light or darkness of the European conflict. The challenge of a new genre, furthermore a genre that Sir Hubert Parry never undertook, could well have appealed to Stanford. By 1916 he had certainly come to feel that he had exhausted the possibilities of symphonic production. His 7th and last symphony dates from 1912. Quite possibly Stanford wished to make a more conspicuous contribution to war work than he had previously done. Parry, it's worth stressing, had unforgettably adorned the Allied cause with his composition of Jerusalem during 1916. There was, besides, a chance that the sonatas might earn for Stanford the composer a following as great as Charles Marie Widor's organ symphonies had already attained. Vidor was in fact the dedicatee of Stanford's second organ sonata. Given Stanford's chronic money troubles, which were exacerbated by the great reduction of Royal College of Music student numbers from 1914 onward, he would have been superhuman had he not wanted to profit from his sonatas in an economic sense. Moreover, one can't discount the likely role of the sonatas as a form of therapy, to use a word that would have left Stanford spluttering with rage. Stanford could well have wanted to distract himself from the tension and powerlessness of civilian existence during the war. Embarking on a truly major compositional project, when after 3 years the hostilities showed no sign of ceasing, had its clear appeal. Both Stanford's children had crossed the Channel to help the war effort, his son Guy as a soldier, his daughter Geraldine as a nurse. The threat of aerial aggression particularly upset Stanford. Conductor and former Stanford pupil Leslie Heward bluntly said the war was a great trial to him, as, like most supersensitive people, he was physically a coward, unquote. Thanks, Leslie. Now tell us what you really feel about Stanford. In an earlier talk here at Monash, I described Stanford's fourth organ sonata, the Sonata Celtica. Today, my main concern is the third organ sonata, opus 152, dating from November 1917 and published the following year by London's Stainer and Bell imprint. The title, Sonata Britannica, is self-evidently patriotic, and by November 1917, British patriotism needed all of the outside reinforcement that it could obtain. During May 1917, mutinies had convulsed large parts of the French army. Since July, the Battle of Passchendaele, also known as the Third Battle of Ypres, had been grinding on with no apparent result, apart from death tolls that, even if we accept the lowest estimates proffered by historians, amounted to at least 200,000 on each side. Alexander Kerensky's provisional government collapsed ignominiously in Russia during November, when defied by militant Bolshevism. Few British observers, however knowledgeable, discerned the full importance and menace of this collapse. A more immediate cause for British fear came with Italy's calamitous defeat on the 19th of November at the Battle of Caporetto by the newly resurgent Central Powers. Not only did 10,000 Italian troops lose their lives, but more than 250,000 other Italian troops allowed themselves to be taken prisoner. 10 days after the Italian army's wreckage, a letter from Lord Lansdowne, the former British Foreign Secretary, appeared in the Daily Telegraph's pages. Lord Lansdowne predicted that the prolongation of war, quote, will spell ruin for the civilized world, unquote. The public outrage caused by this letter, even though Lord Lansdowne had abjured pacifism in the letter and had reaffirmed his desire for an Allied victory, sufficed to indicate how different a country Britain had become since 1914. I cannot resist citing Aldous Huxley's comment about the Lansdowne letter from 3 decades afterwards, this comment being my own all-time favourite 20th century aphorism. For the last 30 years there have been no conservatives. There have been only nationalistic radicals of the right and nationalistic radicals of the left. Yet, perhaps, a still more striking instance of how completely the old Europe had vanished, and an instance with more direct relevance to Stanford's aims, appeared much earlier in the year than the Lansdowne letter. On the 17th of July, jingoistic pressure moved King George V to renounce his dynastic identity as Saxe-Coburg-Gotha and to adopt the impeccably English-sounding surname Windsor instead. At least calling the royal family Windsor served as a British signal to the Central Powers that our Germans are better than your Germans. General Eisenhower, himself of Pennsylvania Germanic stock, benefited from a similar impulse a generation later. H.G. Wells had bewailed the monarchy in public as, quote, an alien and uninspiring court, unquote, to which King George famously answered, I may be uninspiring, but I'll be damned if I'm an alien. Not for nothing does the third and last movement of Stanford's third organ sonata take as its unequivocal thematic basis the hymn tune titled Hanover, composed in the early 18th century by William Croft, and paying homage to the Hanoverian elector imported as British king in 1714. With Opus 152's opening movement, Stanford used a different hymn tune, namely St. Mary. This came from the earliest collection of psalms ever to be published in the Welsh language. It was issued in 1621 by an Anglican minister named Edmund Preece. Although Preece certainly wrote the words, it's not clear whether he also composed this particular melody, which is a strong and attractive one. St. Mary is one of those hymn tunes which have sat there in collections of hymns over centuries, but have never seemed to arouse wider public interest. If I may interpose a personal note here, my first employment as a church organist was back in 1977, but in all those 42 years, no clergy have ever asked me, even once, to play that particular tune. Several different sets of words have been given to the melody in the hymnals, all of these words of a pleading character. The melody's modal nature presupposes contrite tones of literary voice. So does the tune's innate ruggedness, evident in its upward leaping octave near the start, as well as in its exposed downward leaping fifth in the seventh bar. Could Stanford have chosen a Welsh tune and selected his sonata's title through a deliberate desire to proclaim that the struggle against Wilhelm II was no mere English cause, but a Celtic cause also? This theory, at least, would accord with the known facts, and in particular it would accord with the general lack of enthusiasm for the St. Mary melody itself, outside Wales at least. Besides, to the Stanford of late 1917, and to everyone else in Britain at the same date, Wales loomed large because of another reason, a reason altogether unrelated to music. For in December 1916, the Welsh wizard, Lloyd George, had driven Herbert Henry Asquith from the Prime Ministry. Lloyd George went on to prosecute the war effort with an unsparing zeal far beyond anything managed by the gentlemanly, intellectual, irresolute, and increasingly alcoholic Asquith, who was still mourning the death of his son Raymond on the Western Front. Whether or not Stanford had these particular political concerns in the forefront of his thinking, the gusto of his sonata's opening movement is unmistakable. Here's the title page. Notice that Stainer and Bell gave the piece an incorrect opus number. Inept typographers, like the poor, will always be with us. The key of D minor moved Stanford to a decided toughness and strenuousness, as it had moved the Mozart of Don Giovanni's overture, the Beethoven of the Choral Symphony, and the Mendelssohn of Elijah's opening. From the very start of Opus 152, the music is dominated by the original hymn's octave leap. It's also dominated by no-nonsense clashing seconds, sometimes major, sometimes minor, so that the listener's attention is at once seized and held. Stanford's marking con fuoco with fire, frequently to be found in his orchestral works, but much rarer in his other works, indicates his desire that the music shall sound as virtuosic as possible, especially in the quaver flourishes which are meant to suggest improvisation. The pauses in bars 6 and 9 add to the improvisatory atmosphere, and they echo the dramatic pauses which can so often be found in organ fantasias of the Bach Buxtehude type. Similarly dramatic is the way in which Stanford, at bar 10, cuts across the harmony. Stanford's con fuoco marking with fire, frequently to be found in his orchestral works, but much rarer in his other works, indicates his desire that the music shall sound as virtuosic as possible, especially in the quaver flourishes which are meant to suggest improvisation. The pauses in bars 6 and 9 add to the improvisatory atmosphere, and they echo the dramatic pauses which can so often be found in organ fantasies of the Bach Buxtehude type. Similarly dramatic is the way in which Stanford, at bar 10, cuts across the harmonic implications of the previous bar's leading note-based diminished seventh. The listener expects a move back to D minor. Instead of that, Stanford reiterates the opening theme a semitone lower. This gambit has the effect of temporarily but markedly disorienting the listener's tonal sense. Affixed to the second movement, Larghetto, is the title Benedictus, but, contrary to what one might infer from this title, Stanford seems not to have been thinking of any particular plain chant. Examining the various Benedictus settings that are included in the Liber Usualis, which was accorded its first modern edition in 1896, reveals no phrase corresponding to any theme in this movement. On the other hand, the five-note quaver figure of which this larghetto makes plentiful use does call to mind a composition by Sir John Stainer. The composition is the opening andante from 6 pieces of the organ, which Stainer produced in 1897. The letter X indicates where the overlap is. In Stainer, da 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 da, and in the Stanford movement, da 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 da. I've not been able to ascertain whether Stanford meant by the use of this five-note figure to make a deliberate allusion to Stainer, let alone to pay a conscious tribute to the older man, who had died in 1901. Stanford owed Stainer a debt in career terms because Stainer had, in 1880, commissioned from Stanford one of his earliest liturgical works, the Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis, Opus 12. What's more, 6 pieces for the organ attained substantial popularity among performers in the decades following 1897. Back then, quite a few works by Stainer were very well loved by the general public, not just the Crucifixion, for which Stainer is now remembered. I'm sure that you're all familiar with that vicious little joke said to have been a graffito in a London music school. The joke runs, "What do you think of Stainer's Crucifixion?" Answer, "A very good idea." In any case, the melodic parallel, even if inadvertent, is striking enough to justify my mentioning it now. Breezily dispelling the larghetto's piece is the forthright start to the third movement. This movement Stanford has marked allegro molto e ritmico. No metronome indications given, but here's one instance where such an indication on Stanford's part would have been extremely useful, if only to remove the existing uncertainty as to how much the word ritmico should qualify the allegro molto. 2 CD versions of the piece, one made in the UK, the other made in the USA, arrive at dramatically different conclusions concerning speed. Britain's Daniel Cook, at the organ of Durham Cathedral in 2014, adopts a tempo so fast, 172 crotchets to the minute, as to sacrifice all of the requisite rhythmic incisiveness. Stanford's cleverly judged hemiola in the second and third bars can hardly register at such a pace, which turns bars 15 to 18 into nothing so much as an imitation of a hurdy-gurdy. The problems with Cook's furious pulse are worsened by the cathedral's spectacular reverberation, and by microphones located so far from the performer that they seem to have been placed in the next county. On the other hand, the sonata's world premiere recording, made in 1995 by the late Joseph Payne at the organ of a Presbyterian church in Fort Worth, Texas, adopts a much more moderate speed, 128 crotchets to the minute. This might actually be a little too relaxed for an allegro molto. Yet the hearer of Payne's recording is not left with any impression of sluggishness, while the much clearer sound quality enables passing rhythmic details to make their impact. Stanford begins quoting from the William Croft hymn in the finale's very first phrase. There's hardly a single bar of the movement, and there's certainly no bar in the opening section, which cannot be ultimately traced back to Croft's tune. Just how idiosyncratic the tune is can easily be overlooked. Its metre is decidedly unconventional, alternating between 5-syllable lines and 6-syllable lines. Atypical syllabic disposition is not the only quirky characteristic of the hymn. Its words, by Scottish parliamentarian Robert Grant, words not written until 1833, well over a century after Croft composed the tune, are a paraphrase of Psalm 104, and they contain almost no Christian content, except for the 4th and 5th verses, which briefly allude to the Redeemer and ransomed creation, implying Eastertide. The words could perfectly well be sung by Jewish, Muslim, or Unitarian worshippers. Here are the first 2 stanzas. O worship the King, all glorious above. O gratefully sing his power and his love. Our shield and defender, the Ancient of Days, pavilioned in splendour and girded with praise. O tell of his might and sing of his grace, whose robe is the light, whose canopy space. His chariots of wrath the deep thunder clouds form, and dark is his path on the wings of the storm. I need to underline here this textual ecumenism, if only because Stanford, as a lifelong believer in the British Empire, shared, purely by virtue of being such a believer, the general awareness of the empire, and of the monarchical principle more generally, as an ethnic and religious solvent. If the empire failed to constitute such a solvent in actuality, it was not for want of trying. As long as a subject of the British Empire remained loyal to that empire and to its sovereign, it mattered little in authority's eyes whether he or she happened to be Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, Buddhist, Jain, Sikh, or Zoroastrian. Defenders of the empire emphasized that very fact. They feared that without the empire's overlordship, Hindus and Muslims in South Asia would be at each other's throats. The exterminationist carnage attendant upon Indo-Pakistani partition in 1947 made it difficult for posterity to say with confidence that this fear was excessive. But in 1947, Stanford had been 23 years dead, and in 1917, his immediate concern was trying to prevent mayhem among Catholics versus Protestants in British-ruled Ireland. The imperial military effort against the Central Powers could at least, Stanford hoped, subsume the Emerald Isles' sectarian differences in the common aim of trouncing the Kaiser. Stanford had a precedent for this belief. France had managed to achieve exactly such a subsuming. In the French army of 1917, the most passionate Catholics and the most passionate anti-Catholics shared the same trenches and the same hardships. They discovered that they all bled alike. No outside observer could have predicted such a grand rapprochement on the strength of France's existential conflicts shortly beforehand, conflicts which had amounted to a low-level civil war. The Boulanger affair of the late 1880s, the Dreyfus Affair of the late 1890s, and the 1905 governmental disestablishment of Catholicism per se. Hence, I would argue, Stanford's choice of a hymn like Hanover, with the mostly non-specific monotheism of the text, as the raw material for the sonata's argument. I've already cited Eisenhower, and I'm reminded in this context of Eisenhower's much-quoted remark shortly after he won his first presidential election in 1952. On that occasion, he told his fellow Americans, quote, "Our form of government has no sense unless it is founded in a deeply felt religious faith, and I don't care what it is." Unquote. Something like these words must have occurred to every commander-in-chief of international forces where more than one religion is practiced. The fact that nearly all of the text of Hanover proclaims God's majesty, "O worship the King," and not his compassion, let alone whatever transient personal emotions individual mortals might have concerning him, these things should also be noted, given that George V was theoretically still Chief of the Armed Forces. Often, with earlier Stanford pieces based on a pre-existing theme, one has to wait until near the end before the use of the theme as a whole becomes so obvious that even the least attentive hearer will register it. So with this finale. As Berlioz and Ravel understood, rapid modulations in a climactic passage are a sure means of keeping audiences alert. Stanford demonstrates this truth here, particularly when, at bars 301 to 306, a timpani-like pedal line reinforces the tonic D against tonally restive manual chords. The concluding phrases echo the very first phrase's hemiola rhythm, as well as the hymn tune's final 2 bars. They bring to a suitably dramatic close a sonata that, taken all in all, might not be among Stanford's very deepest creations, but is unquestionably among his liveliest ones. Looking back on what I've been saying in this talk, I'm uneasily conscious of how much of it has needed to be conjectural. I've lacked what America's music historian Rafe Locke recently called on Facebook a smoking gun. The trouble is, conjecture is almost all we have when it comes to the 5 organ sonatas. Stanford, so voluble when it came to commenting upon other composers' music, was extremely reticent when it came to commenting upon his own music, and in particular his own organ music. Of course, sometimes composers who do comment upon their own music are more of a hindrance than a help. After all, it would require a very naive historian indeed to take at face value any remark made by Berlioz, or by Wagner, or Mahler, or Granger, or Ives, or Stravinsky on any aesthetic subject more controversial than the weather. Still, at least the interpretations which I've attempted to tease out of Stanford's organ works are compatible with the known facts of Stanford's creativity, his political convictions, and his artistic outlook. I don't claim more than that, but I do claim that. To conclude, with my lectures on Stanford's organ music, I seem to have fallen into the habit of citing one spectacularly fatuous quotation from a musical authority who should have known better. This time, my quotation comes from the Edwardian music critic John F. Runciman. In 1901, Runciman, whose hostility to Stanford was celebrated, greeted a Stanford premiere by denouncing Stanford's professorial status. Runciman, displaying all the tact, wisdom, and understated elegance of Andrew Bolt accosting a Swedish teenage girl on the autism spectrum, administered to Stanford the following reprimand. The academic cannot be joyous and natural for many minutes at a time. He must needs everlastingly be knitting his brows, folding his arms on his breast, and delivering rhetorical fustian, poverty-stricken imitations of the great master's great effects. in what he considers the grand manner." Unquote. I think that by now I've said enough about Stanford's third organ sonata to indicate how much fervent emotion his music can achieve, and how unfair it was for Runciman or anyone else to have used against him the term academic as if it were a swear word. By now, there's a substantial literature about Elgar's propensity for musical, dare one say, enigmas, his lifelong enthusiasm for puzzles, secrets, and red herrings. It would be a kind of poetic justice if Stanford, with his agonized relationship to Elgar over the decades, a relationship veering between the extremes of admiration and loathing on both sides, should have turned out to have a similar penchant to Elgar's for writing in code. Ladies and gentlemen, thanks very much.